I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it.
Britain was braced for yet another carefully sanitized royal press release. What the public received instead was a declaration profound enough to irreversibly shift the emotional and structural equilibrium of the monarchy itself. King Charles had reached a definitive conclusion, and Queen Camilla's standing beside him would no longer possess the same institutional gravity. Beneath the stiff, formal vocabulary lay a reality that was agonizingly personal. A husband drawing a line in the sand, a queen confronting abrupt and undeniable uncertainty, and an ancient family coming to terms with the fact that an era of silent compromise had abruptly concluded. Before we delve into the intricate details of what this historic shift truly means for the survival of the royal family, please be sure to subscribe so you never miss a single update on this unfolding drama. King Charles was acutely aware that his chosen words would strike like a physical blow. For several agonizing weeks, internal tension had pulled the royal household taut as senior family members privately clashed over exactly how far Camilla's administrative influence should be permitted to stretch into ceremonial planning and the vital decisions shaping the impending generation. The royal household, the sprawling apparatus of staff, private secretaries and offices that sustain the sovereign and the working royals, had quietly transformed into a polite but ruthless battlefield. Then, the monarch made his mandate crystal clear. Camilla would absolutely remain his legally wedded wife and his crowned queen, but her autonomous jurisdiction over internal household logistics, forthcoming state ceremonies, and select familial representation would be completely redirected back to the sovereign and his direct heir. Sitting in total solitude, Charles reviewed the finalized draft prior to its global dispatch. Upon reaching the specific paragraph that systematically dismantled her executive authority, he slowly removed his reading glasses and placed the parchment flat upon his mahogany desk. For a long, heavy span of seconds, he remained entirely mute. That profound silence was significant because this maneuver was not a forced retirement, a legal separation, a punitive sanction, or a stripping of her royal styles. It was something vastly more calculated and inherently painful. He was fiercely protecting his marriage, while simultaneously surgically severing it from the constitutional powers capable of dictating the landscape after his eventual passing. Queen Camilla was handed the decree merely minutes before it was broadcast to the world. She absorbed the critical sentence twice over, her initial shock rapidly mutating into a quiet, simmering disbelief rather than explosive rage. She slowly lifted her gaze toward the senior aide hovering nervously in the periphery and asked a single piercing question. Had the king personally approved every single syllable? When the aide quietly confirmed that he had, the atmospheric pressure in the room permanently shifted. Her royal title was entirely safe. Her physical place at his side was guaranteed. But the invisible, unyielding walls enclosing that place had suddenly been illuminated for everyone to see. Prince William had already been thoroughly briefed. As the direct heir, the individual positioned first in the line of succession to inherit the throne, his active inclusion telegraphed that the long-term survival of the crown was the beating heart of this painful maneuver. The Prince of Wales grasped that this structural overhaul was not born from a solitary petty disagreement. It was a preemptive strike designed to prevent ambiguity from hardening into constitutional precedent, ensuring that the colossal institution Charles would eventually pass down possessed a single, uncompromised chain of command. When the aides finally bowed and retreated, Camilla did not follow them. The heavy doors clicked shut, and she remained perfectly still in her chair, gripping the heavy stock paper without turning the page. After a long moment, she issued one softly spoken but absolute command: bring Charles to her, entirely in private. While the abrupt announcement had successfully stunned the British public, the prevailing question echoing through the velvet-lined corridors of the palace was vastly more intimate. What catastrophic internal fracture could possibly compel a monarch to publicly barricade the authority of the very woman he had spent over 2 decades fiercely defending against global scrutiny? The declaration read as a dry constitutional adjustment, but its ripple effects were devastatingly human. Charles was not simply managing the career trajectory of a mid-level courtier, he was actively suppressing the public footprint of his own spouse.
For Camilla, this was not merely a loss of administrative chores. It was a brutal confrontation with the reality that her exhausting, decades-long campaign to secure her legitimacy had violently collided with an invisible, impenetrable ceiling. Meanwhile, Prince William, observing the fallout from the vantage point of the incoming era, was now saddled with the heavy realization that his future sovereignty had become the central catalyst for his father's most agonizing personal sacrifice. Charles felt the crushing weight of this choice deeply, precisely because he had dedicated the vast majority of his adult existence to shielding her and validating her vital importance to his life. He had weathered relentless media crucifixion, fierce institutional pushback, and decades of public skepticism before Camilla was finally permitted to stand beside him at the coronation. That grueling shared history rendered his current decision infinitely more brutal. However, the crown, representing the enduring official authority and the monumental responsibility of the state, rather than merely the flawed human being currently bearing its weight, demanded a ruthless continuity that superseded any single marriage. The king was agonizingly aware that constitutional logic provided absolutely no anesthetic for personal heartbreak. Camilla felt that heartbreak wash over her instantaneously. She had battled for every inch of her acceptance, painstakingly learning how to navigate the microscopic scrutiny of royal existence, while constantly proving she could inhabit the institution without being devoured by the ghosts of its past.
Now, the high-level responsibilities she had comfortably assumed were hers by right were being unceremoniously rerouted. The deepest wound was not the confiscation of specific state duties. It was the chilling realization that achieving public acceptance had never actually equated to securing permanent institutional power. She could legally belong to the ancient family, yet still be explicitly instructed where her right to belong abruptly terminated. Prince William stepped into the private briefing room carrying an identical tension, though he wore it very differently. As the immediate heir to the throne, he implicitly understood exactly why his father had dragged him into the fray. Nevertheless, he policed every single syllable he uttered. Any fleeting shadow of satisfaction or relief would instantly frame the ordeal as a self-serving son capitalizing on his stepmother's calculated downfall. He maintained a rigidly measured tone as King Charles meticulously detailed how ceremonial logistics, household staffing decisions, and long-range representative planning would systematically migrate back toward the sovereign, the Prince of Wales, and the core working blood royals. Charles allowed his voice to drop to a somber register when the dialogue inevitably pivoted to the future. He explicitly told his son that this drastic measure was strictly about what survives them both. That single, heavy sentence altered the temperature of the room. The monarch was not complaining about a fleeting domestic dispute or a frustrating morning meeting.
He was agonizing over the architectural integrity of the monarchy that would exist long after his own demise, obsessing over what ironclad structures would remain standing once the glue of personal affection and loyalty dissolved. Camilla was simultaneously digesting this exact same reality through the freshly revised portfolio of responsibilities placed on her desk. Nothing had simply evaporated into thin air. The power and duties were just being methodically relocated to other desks. That dawning comprehension made the internal restructuring feel agonizingly permanent. As William reached the threshold to exit the briefing, he paused and glanced back over his shoulder. Charles remained anchored to his chair, staring blankly at his wife's name printed on the document before him. Neither man uttered a word. The silence was sufficient. They both knew this verdict had been set in motion long before the official press release was ever drafted. To fully comprehend exactly why the reigning king ultimately crossed a boundary he had fiercely resisted for years, the narrative must rewind to a specific ceremonial event where a hushed, polite disagreement mutated into an undeniable crisis. Nearly every historic royal fracture can be traced back to a seemingly mundane moment that looks entirely ordinary until the lens of history refocuses upon it. In this particular saga, that catalyst materialized during the meticulous preparations for a major state service.
When a localized squabble over protocol ceased being a trivial matter of seating charts, walking precedents, or visual symbolism, it rapidly escalated into a high-stakes stress test to determine exactly who possessed the leverage to mold the monarchy's future. Charles desperately attempted to smother the tension behind closed doors. Prince William stubbornly refused to let the issue slide. Camilla fiercely defended her territory, and one intensely private confrontation transformed a lingering sense of unease into a constitutional mandate that could no longer be delayed. Initially, Charles clung to the hope that the friction was manageable. The upcoming Commonwealth service at Westminster Abbey was meticulously designed to project an impenetrable aura of continuity and stability across the entire royal apparatus. Instead, the exhaustive planning sessions laid bare the exact opposite. Protocol, the rigid, ancient rulebook that dictates the hierarchy, physical positioning, and delegated authority during state events, had unexpectedly morphed into the epicenter of a brutal power struggle. Queen Camilla's private office aggressively lobbied for the right to sign off on the positioning of senior family members before the plans were routed to Prince William's team. The Prince of Wales immediately filed a formal objection, astutely recognizing that conceding to this logistical arrangement would silently, irreversibly establish a lethal precedent for every future state ceremony. Immediately following the planning committee's adjournment, William confronted his father. He kept his temper tightly leashed, but his warning was razor-sharp.
He explicitly warned the king that this was not merely about the logistics of one church service. It was about the dangerous reality of what becomes the accepted institutional norm if nobody has the courage to stop it in its tracks. Charles absorbed the warning instantly. Temporary, ad hoc logistical compromises possessed a nasty habit of calcifying into unshakable royal tradition if they were repeated often enough. And the future king was essentially sounding the alarm that one polite concession today could warp the monarchy's operational structure decades into the future. Camilla, however, completely rejected the notion that this was merely a dry, technical adjustment. During a private audience with Charles later that evening, she confronted him directly, arguing that arbitrarily kneecapping her office's authority now would broadcast to the world that she was merely being tolerated by the establishment rather than genuinely trusted. Those specific words struck Charles much harder than any display of shouting or rage ever could have. He knew exactly how many years she had spent suffocating under the weight of public suspicion. He knew the staggering emotional toll of earning the nation's begrudging acceptance, and he understood how agonizing it would be for her to feel that this hard-won acceptance was still tethered to an invisible, restrictive leash. Charles desperately searched for a middle ground, but the cold, hard facts systematically eliminated his options.
He quietly requested the files from 2 previous ceremonial events and discovered the exact same creeping expansion of Camilla's authority permanently inked into the official approval logs. That revelation was the point of no return. This was no longer an isolated spat over seating arrangements at Westminster Abbey. It had officially become a behavioral pattern, and within the ancient walls of the monarchy, unchecked patterns swiftly harden into permanent precedent before anyone dares to call it out. Late that night, the king returned to the ceremony dossier. He opened the leather binding, carefully extracted the approval sheet bearing the authorizing notation from Camilla's private office, and physically transferred it into a separate sealed folder marked for high-level review. The physical motion was subtle, but its symbolic weight was colossal. For the very first time in his reign, he had actively, physically amputated her authority from the institutional framework he was sworn to protect. However, quietly auditing paperwork in the dead of night was one thing. Looking Camilla in the eye and informing her that the operational authority she firmly believed she had earned was being forcefully revoked required a devastating confrontation that neither of them could escape. There were no flashing cameras, no groveling courtiers to act as buffers, and no flowery ceremonial jargon potent enough to soften the blow of what Charles was obligated to say.
Over the decades, their bond had miraculously survived venomous public hostility, bitter resistance from the blood family, and the crushing gravity of historical legacy. Yet this specific confrontation felt uniquely perilous because the existential threat was originating from deep inside the very life they had sacrificed everything to build together. Camilla demanded to know, point blank, whether he still possessed any faith in her. Charles was forced into the agonizing position of explaining why his personal trust in his wife and the delegation of sovereign authority had abruptly become two entirely incompatible concepts. The king had stubbornly insisted on delivering the verdict himself before the press release was locked in. He outright refused to permit private secretaries or palace fixers to carry a message of this magnitude between them. Charles established one absolute fact immediately. The sanctity of their marriage was not under review, and her hard-won title was not in jeopardy. The conflict was strictly isolated to executive authority, the rigid bounds of protocol, and the architectural safeguarding of the monarchy's future. Protocol, in this specific bureaucratic context, defined the strict hierarchy dictating who possesses the power to approve, direct, or take precedence during official state functions. That academic distinction looked perfectly reasonable printed on briefing paper. Inside the drawing room, it felt like a surgical strike. Camilla absorbed his explanation without interjecting, until one singular, devastating question pierced through the diplomatic rhetoric. She looked directly at her husband and asked if he was actively protecting the crown from her.
Charles did not offer an immediate response. The ensuing silence hung in the air just long enough to solidify into a heartbreaking affirmation in her own mind. She had weathered decades of relentless judgment pouring in from outside the palace gates, but this betrayal felt fundamentally different. This was friendly fire, coming directly from the man who had spent his entire life screaming to the establishment that she belonged at his side. When Charles finally found his voice, he gently told her that he was protecting the ancient institution from the dangers of uncertainty, not from her personally. Unfortunately, his careful phrasing only twisted the knife deeper. To Camilla's ears, uncertainty simply sounded like a cowardly, sanitized synonym for mistrust. She internalized it as a direct indictment of her influence, her judgment, and the horrifying possibility that there had always been a strict limit on how deeply she had truly been embraced by the firm. Her simmering hurt sharpened into acute anger the moment Prince William's name was introduced into the timeline. She instantly calculated that the heir had been brought into the fold and consulted long before she was made aware, which immediately escalated the betrayal from a painful marital dispute into a highly orchestrated succession strategy. The future king was already being granted the power to dictate what elements of authority would be allowed to survive after Charles was gone. Charles vehemently refused to allow that narrative to go unchallenged.
He revealed that his most senior constitutional advisors had actually pushed for far more draconian restrictions, up to and including a massive public stripping of her working duties, and that he had aggressively vetoed them. He framed the finalized arrangement as a necessary boundary, but also as a desperate act of marital protection. He was deliberately curtailing her executive reach in order to shield her dignity, preserve their union, and secure her unshakable place at his side. Camilla abruptly pushed her chair back and stood up. For a breathless second, it appeared she would storm out of the room. Instead, she paused, turned back to face the sovereign, and asked exactly who possessed the right to decide what she was permitted to be from this day forward. Charles could easily provide an answer as a loving husband, but the ruthless machinery of the monarchy demanded a much colder truth, because towering behind their intimate marital dispute stood an ancient, unfeeling system deciding exactly where true power resided. The transfer of royal power is rarely accompanied by shouting matches or dramatic television moments. Far more often, it slithers through the palace via quietly amended briefing lists, quietly retracted approval permissions, absent signatures on state documents, and heavy oak doors that suddenly require a different courtier's clearance to open. In the immediate wake of Charles's ruling, the sprawling palace apparatus began the tedious work of translating one explosive public announcement into dozens of humiliating, microscopic daily realities.
Yet, lurking behind every minor logistical tweak sat the exact same agonizing truth. Camilla remained the queen, but the operational machinery surrounding her was being systematically, intentionally starved of oxygen, while Prince William was being aggressively pulled into the absolute center of the vacuum. Charles personally presided over the inaugural restructuring committee, acutely aware that every mundane logistical shift would carry a heavy emotional toll. Senior household executives commenced the surgical process of ripping ceremonial approval powers, familial representation logistics, and high-level calendar coordination directly out of the hands of Camilla's independent staff.
Ceremonial approval, the heavily guarded process used to legally dictate who is permitted to attend, lead, or hold ultimate jurisdiction during massive state events, was now tethered directly back to the king's desk. With decisions impacting long-range continuity now mandating Prince William's direct sign-off, Charles sat silently as a senior aide scrolled to a master approval column and methodically deleted the initials representing Camilla's office. The digital keystroke took mere seconds, but the king's jaw clenched visibly. He had personally mandated the execution of the order, yet witnessing the physical erasure of her influence made the personal cost agonizingly real. The queen was not being scrubbed from royal existence, but she was being forcibly amputated from the strategic nerve center capable of dictating the architectural layout of the impending reign. Prince William absorbed this structural shift without a single ounce of victorious pride.
When a sycophantic advisor foolishly attempted to frame the ruthless restructuring as a massive strengthening of the prince's personal power base, William immediately shut the conversation down. He issued a stern directive that this painful transition was never, under any circumstances, to be spun or celebrated as a defeat for Queen Camilla, correctly identifying that public humiliation would only pour gasoline on the fracture already threatening to split the family in two. His strict boundary was rooted in practical survival just as much as personal empathy. He knew that inheriting a legally fortified future monarchy would be entirely worthless if the brutal process of building it publicly incinerated the fragile human relationships required to keep the current one afloat. It was then that Charles discovered the cancer of the problem had metastasized far deeper than initially calculated. A highly classified long-term master schedule revealed that several colossal state ceremonies were already deep in the planning phases, all operating under the outdated assumption that Camilla's office possessed sweeping jurisdiction months into the future. This glaring discovery validated the king's darkest anxieties. This was not a simple symbolic reprimand that could be tossed to the press and immediately forgotten. The compromised power structure was already deeply embedded like a virus into the future calendar. Charles issued an immediate, uncompromising edict.
Every single one of those long-term plans was to be entirely scrapped and rewritten from scratch prior to their official publication, with the approval hierarchies aggressively redrawn and the chains of responsibility explicitly segregated. William would now be a mandatory consultation point on any matter touching upon succession and long-term continuity. While the reigning monarch naturally retained ultimate veto power, this operational pivot was now permanent and systemic enough to reverberate far beyond one highly uncomfortable week. Later that afternoon, a private secretary marched down the crimson-carpeted corridor, clutching two freshly updated briefing dossiers. One folder still bore Queen Camilla's royal cipher. The second was freshly stamped for the Prince of Wales. The contents of those two folders overlapped significantly less than they had just 24 hours prior. The palace possessed the terrifying ability to reorganize the entire state apparatus in total silence, but no amount of discretion could possibly shield Camilla from the inevitable, deeply personal moment she collided with the first undeniable consequence of her downgraded reality. The true, bone-chilling weight of a monumental royal decree rarely registers the moment the press release hits the wire. More often, the reality strikes days later in a completely familiar environment when an individual suddenly realizes the basic rules of their daily existence have been quietly rewritten while they slept. For Queen Camilla, this brutal epiphany materialized as she prepared to attend a high-level senior planning summit that she would have historically entered without a second thought.
This time, the standard briefing protocol was glaringly different. Her constitutional parameters had been shrunk, and for the very first time, the ironclad boundary erected by King Charles became impossible for her to personally ignore. She glided into the boardroom fully expecting to assume the exact same operational posture she had held for years. The agenda centered on an impending, massive national ceremony that heavily featured Charles, William, and a contingent of senior working royals, meaning every microscopic decision regarding walking order, public responsibility, and family optics was incredibly high stakes. A comprehensive ceremonial briefing, the master blueprint that dictates the exact choreography of who does what during a televised royal event, had been generated for every principal involved. Yet, as she glanced toward her customary leather chair, she found the mahogany table completely bare. There was no classified working folder waiting for her review.
Camilla did not immediately register shock or outrage. A senior aide approached and, with a painfully polite, hushed tone, explained that the final approval authority for the event had already been permanently relocated upstairs in accordance with the new structural mandate. She was assured she would receive a finalized read-only copy of the itinerary once all the strategic decisions had been locked in by the king in the air, but she would no longer be granted a seat at the table to help shape the initial draft. The queen offered a slow, dignified nod. She did not launch into an argument.